All right, well, good morning, everybody. Welcome back or welcome to Federal Fiscal Grants Communities of Practice. This is a group that we created to meet monthly about all things federal grant compliance wise. So if you're new to the group, we'll talk about that in just a minute, but it's the 10 o'clock hour, so we're going to get started. So with that, here's our full agenda for the day. Super excited to welcome in a new season of Communities of Practice. We're going to recap our purpose and talk about things on our radar on that data acquisition calendar. We're also going to recap a little bit of what we went through last year, some of the things we trained on to help introduce some of you to grant management in general. And then we're going to look at, for our PD in 15 today, it might actually be a little shorter than that. We're going to talk about some definitions, some vocabulary, some lingo, grant lingo to help you guys navigate some of our trainings and some other just grant oversight and compliance that you may need to know. Then we're going to get back into our favorite friend of the Uniform Grant Guidance. We're going to talk about cost principles today, and that's part of the subpart E section. So we'll dive into that today. That's really, what does it mean to be reasonable, necessary, and allocable? So we'll talk about that. And then we're going to go program specific on some of those allowable costs today with Sarah Seamont from the federal programs team. And we are so lucky to have her today to help get in the weeds on that. Then we're going to introduce some new quick guide resources coming up. And then to recap, we've got some links for you if you're not already registered to attend the ESEA IDEA Fall Conference. So let's get started. So yay, welcome to a new school year. We are, again, very excited to launch this new year of our Communities of Practice. So I always have the chat opened up, and I'm hoping as I keep talking on the next few slides, I'd like to hear some ideas. What are some of the things you're most excited for? And it doesn't have to be grant compliance, but what are some of the things you're most excited for this new school year and this new season? Maybe you're in the business office and you guys implemented some new software that you're super excited about, or maybe you're just glad because all your kids are in school now. So please chime in the chat, just for everybody's sake, to be able to look and see that other people are going through some of the things that you are. So while we're waiting for some of those chat answers to come in about things you're excited for, let's talk about what is the Community of Practice again. When we first launched this last October, this was a slide from last October, and it says, so what is the Community of Practice? That's a group that comes together to try and share concerns, passions, shared experiences, expertise, knowledge. It's a community. So we've all got similar positions. This group invite goes out to charter administrators. It goes out and they wear many, many hats, if you don't know that, into business managers or accounting technicians, folks that have to read grant lingo, and then program directors for both title, and we invite to title, but we hope you'll share it out with other directors, and then special ed directors. And again, many of those folks wear similar same hats with multiple job duties, right? So what are our Communities of Practice doing? What are they providing for us? Well, really, again, it's this shared community, right? It's this group together that we bring together for knowledge sharing, peer-to-peer. So we're trying to develop and learn the why behind things. We're trying to develop best practices and strategies and resource sharing and bringing up one-off scenarios that you think might be a one-off scenario to you, but possibly has similar implications for another district or charter. So again, we're bringing ourselves together, reminding each other of timelines, and we're trying to just support and build confidence between each other. Okay. Sorry, I keep trying to do too many things at once. All right, let me move forward. Let's try and take a recap, glance over some of the things we did since last October when we first launched. And thanks again to my counterpart over here in special ed offices, Israel Silva has put this together for us. It's going to serve as kind of a table of contents that we'll be posting with the other Communities of Practice content, so that you guys can refer back to know which month it was that we talked about those things. We post individual little mini segments of the PowerPoints or in a PDF format, but this will give you like, which month did they present this on, in case I need to go back and watch the recording. I really just need to hear what they said about federal funds and food, for instance. So I'm going to look at here and say, oh, that was in January, and I can go find that recording. So Wow, this was a lot of content just in the first year. When you look at this, um, we introduced what the community of practice was. We gave a high level overview in that first month of federal regulations and structure. We talked about, when you think back or go watch that, we talked about how there's several segments. We have federal regulations, we have state regulations, and we have our local LEA district or charter rules and policies that we have in place that we have to try and navigate for everything we do, for running our programs, to adhering to those policies and practices that align with our own school policy. Anyway, looking through, we've had Grant 101. We talked about Edgar. We talked about different, components of maintenance of effort from the ESEA side to special ed side. We introduced the compliance supplement to some people, and I had feedback they didn't even know that existed. That's kind of like your cheat sheet to what your auditors are looking for. So that's something that's helpful to know about. We talked about position budgeting last year, the federal fiscal cliff in general, and that's something that you're going to continue to hear presented from the State Department. If you don't know already, Special Education American Rescue Plan Act funds are ending. You have to have them spent by this September 30th of 2023, and ESSER the next year. So you're going to hear more and more coming from the ESSER folks in the federal programs teams about final ways to spend that out and make an impact at your district or at your charter. But as you can see, we try to mix in tips and tricks. We try to mix in some components of your peers to present, and other folks at the State Department. I've brought in people from child nutrition programs, and I brought in someone from state school finance to talk about indirect cost rates. And we also had the district's view, and I got really great feedback that, hey, it was great to see another district business manager and how they digest that and how they process this in their district. So bottom line, we present on a lot of things, and we'll continue to go there when you guys continue to ask. So speaking of, what are some topics you want? Last month, we did a survey, just what are some more topics you guys want to talk about in communities of practice or that you want training on? We did get some feedback. Hey, let's go into the weeds a little further on Edgar, a little bit more advanced accounting strategies. We'd like to share some accounting strategies, like perhaps somebody is really, 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 really good in 2M or in Infinite Visions, and they figured out this great way that if you set it up this way, you practically pre-make your CFA and you just hit print for your auditor. So those types of things, what can we do? So I've kind of got my eye out on some of you guys that I've heard, hey, so-and-so's really great in this system. So if you get a ping from me, don't be surprised. It's because we've been looking at this so we can see if you guys can come together for some targeted help between each other. Always get requests for time and effort reminders and refreshers and uniform grant guidance. We barely have skimmed the surface, and just so y'all know, it's going to be changing. So federal programs team and myself are all trying to digest those new changes that are coming out because they're going to be needed to be implemented next year. So we will keep you trained on that. But again, I also had requests for breakout sessions so that we can discuss things. So maybe that's where we'll say, hey, everyone that's a Visions user, go to this break room or this discussion room. So those might be things that we try to do this year. So what else would you like to see? Throw it in the chat. I'm interested to see what else are you guys interested in? Because I mean, at the end of the day, this is your platform to come together. You guys request from us at the State Department, and we share back with you. So I wanted to take a look at the chat really quick because I had asked on a previous slide, what are you most excited about? And someone had said, having helped to reduce my workload. So yay for you. That is huge. I'm so excited for you. But just that everybody's always excited at the beginning of the year. And how can we help you maintain that, really? People saying they're grateful for the ARP funds, but glad to see them spent. Amen. Everybody's saying, hey, let us know. Oh yeah, Kathy Gavi chiming in, let us know if you need help with ESSER ideas. And absolutely, we're going to have them present more throughout this year as you guys get closer to those funds ending. But again, if you have other ideas that you're wanting to look for, throw those in the chat. We take a snapshot of the chat at the end of this so that we'll be able to take that into account to know what else we can do to help present this year. And so we also want to take this moment to welcome the new federal programs director, if you haven't already seen this in any of the other communications coming out of the State Department, but we want to welcome Josh Notaboom. So he comes to us most recently from the Village Leadership Team. But here's a little mini bio. There's a lot more in some of the other communications that have gone out, but let's give a big warm welcome to Josh. And he is so committed, having that charter expertise and also coming from district. So he's been in the weeds where you have been sitting. So that's really great to have him over here to help us have that insight from that perspective. So our normal flow of what we do every month is we take a look at, we call it what's on your radar, and this is that data acquisition calendar. There's a new look that was started this last month, and here we are in August. We always just bring this up as a talking point so that you can take a look and say, oh man, I know that person that's doing that report. Maybe I'll go ask if they need any support on that. Or maybe there's one that totally fell off your radar, and that's again why we call it the radar. What's on here? What needs to still be done? So at this point, you've already passed everything except the last two items that are due here at the end of the month. Those are both child nutrition related. So if you know somebody, or maybe it's you, make sure that you have that, somebody in your district, is going to be providing that report or that information. Looks like some civil rights compliance, and then the child and adult care food program application and renewal. So we have all the links for info within the actual data acquisition calendar, and a link will be provided here. And then let's talk about September, because September is kind of big. I like to look at the department column on top of due dates, but just to say, in case you're special ed, zoom in on the special ed. And when you actually go to the data acquisition calendar, they've made it so you can filter. You can filter on department, you can filter on the due date, you can filter on whatever. So that's very helpful. So think about that when you go there, so you can target just what you're in charge of. If you're an administrator, you probably need to look at all of this. But really, I didn't want to filter out this month. I know that the IASBO group that meets with Julie Oberly and the state school finance team, they talk about these things as well. But just again, to give you all the overall arching view of everything your district or charter has to deal with in a given month. There's a lot on here, right? A lot. Some of the things I wanted to point out was you may get notified by the special education team, since that's where I work, if you had any areas of non-compliance. Looks like there's some items coming up under the migrant program. So that's going to be Sarah Seamont, who's also presenting today. And again, just back into the federal programs, you've got your Title I annual performance reports. You've got stuff for content and curriculum. And then it looks like for the Title I neglect and delinquent programs, again, that's Emily Summer. So there's definitely a lot of reports, even public transportation. You've got some stuff you've got to do this month. So don't let this fall off your radar. This is us just making you think about it. All right. So real quick, we also always do a recap. Now, we recognize that a lot of you guys are just back on contract for the year, or you might be watching this recording because you haven't started. This isn't your first week of school, perhaps. So we still provided a July training, even though many of you guys were off contract. And the reason really behind that was because we have so much to train on. We wanted to peak some ideas, specifically more geared towards some of the accounting staff and the business managers. So we started putting this out there. We've got links to the recording and to the PDFs. But we did gift card training. We did procurement training, which is huge in the weeds. And then we did an overview with special education. So really high view highlight. In general, we talked about how it doesn't look good. A lot of folks don't like it. And it's really not something that should be an allowable expense for the most part, super high level, right? Then we talked about the why. Well, what's the reasoning behind why we shouldn't be using public funds? And I'm saying public, not just federal, but public. Well, conflict of interest, personal benefit. Think about your constituents and what they might think. They don't want to see somebody benefiting from something. And then also there's no audit trail. So that's the biggest reason. You can't tell what someone bought. We don't want to be using public funds to buy alcohol and those types of things. So that's one of the reasons. And then specifically, we talked about some of the IRS rules and laws behind this. And so regardless of the amount, if you give a gift card to an employee, it could be, it should be considered part of a taxable wage. I know that's so boring. I want to give out gift cards once in a while. So this is where we talked also about, okay, there's always going to be an exception, and you also still have to look at those three tiers. What does the federal rule say? What does the state rule say? What does our local rule say? If you guys have an agreement that you have a threshold you've set, it's in your board policies, it's under a certain threshold, and your auditors are also in the loop on that. I'm not saying you can't do that. We're asking you to think in general about some of the high level rules so that you guys can then interpret on your own level. But with the examples for the exceptions, I also wanted to talk about, and we had a whole slide on the McKinney-Vento exceptions that might occur. Perhaps one of, a store card, or let's say you bought a card specific for laundry purposes. There's all kinds of exceptions, and we had the perfect thing happened last month where we had somebody watching or listening later that said, hey, I'm pretty sure we bought gift cards for the migrant ed program. Are we not supposed to? So they did the perfect thing, and they reached out to their coordinator and they said, hey, Sarah, I thought we could do these things. Is that still allowable? So yes is the answer. And there's probably lots more exceptions. So the answer is, if you've done it in the past and you're not even sure why you were allowed to, let's figure out why. So we will make sure that we keep this as a printed allowable cost as well, so that you guys have that. You can have that backup and support for an auditor if they ask why you're doing it. Well, it's because we can do this under the program regulations. And Sarah will get into that later when she's doing her presentation. And I'll tell you, there's even a couple of exceptions under gift cards, possibly even under special ed in some cases. I know there is with food. So there's always an exception. So don't be afraid to ask. Now, we trained a lot on procurement. This was just my list of what we talked about within procurement. So if you're interested in that, I'm not going to get into the weeds, but we did a lot. We even talked about, thresholds, procurement and practice. It was a lot. But overall, what is procurement? We talked about how really it goes back to the LEAs have to consider state, local LEA, and federal procurement guidelines. And you have to go with whatever's the strictest regulation. So sometimes people think that the federal regulation is the highest, strictest, whatever. But we have found, especially in procurement, that sometimes districts set a lower threshold that they want you to get bids for and things like that. So again, lots of components too that we should think about when we're doing purchasing. You probably have several, if not just at least two staff for somebody in an approval chain, and that it does require a policy. Somewhere you have a policy, a board policy that's specific to your district. So it's always good to review what those are. And then again, various funding sources and grant funded programs could have additional restrictions. So that's where you have to think about who's the most restrictive. Then we also did this special education overview. And so we talked about IDEA is Individuals with Disabilities Act. We talked about how you hear IDEA Part B. Well, the Part B part means ages 3 to 21. That's who we serve. Ages 0 to 3 is served by, here in Idaho, our Department of Health and Welfare for ages 0 to 3. So we broke that down. We talked about the 6 key elements, and this was a presentation by Debbie Smith, and they talked about everything from evaluation through safeguards, through giving that free appropriate public education. You'll hear FAPE, that's what that is. We talked about parental participation and how that's important. They have to sign off on things and be in the know. What's an IEP? That's that individualized education program. If you just heard IEP, you may have never known what that stood for. And then we talked about, very briefly, least restrictive environment, integrating those kids in the classroom, in the gen ed classroom. And then she went over a lot of resources. So there's full slide presentations. This is just, again, to remind you of what you may have missed in case you want to go back and review that. But now we're going to move into our professional development at 15, and it's going to be shorter than that. So subpart A, so back in Uniform Grant Guidance, 2 CFR 200, UGG, there is something called the subpart A, and it's acronyms and definitions. And this is just a screenshot from when you go to this link for the Code of Federal Regulations. So these are definitions that help you understand all the lingo that you see, possibly if you're in grants.gov and you're applying for a grant in general for your district or charter, or even some of the things you see on our grant award notifications. You might not understand what they mean. So here's a little snippet of view of some of the things. It's alphabetical. They like they've redefined assistance listing numbers, used to be CFDA. So all those things are defined in here. It talks about who's the auditor. I mean, there's all kinds of different pieces in there. But really, learning federal terminology is important to fully understand our fiscal and our programmatic intentions and rules. And that's what we're all about on this Communities of Practice. So this is a great just reference that you can use to be able to break it down and say, okay, they always talk about what's the cost objective, or what's something that's allowable. Well, they also define disallowed. They have corrective actions means. So you'll hear if you ever have a corrective action plan that you have to implement. So very useful to make sense of it all. All right, that was way less than 15, but that's okay because we have a lot of content today. Next, we wanted to talk about cost principles. So this is 2 CFR 200, again, Uniform Grant Guidance, Subpart E. And this is important to help us understand what's allowable. Now, I want to start with kind of just grant policies here, and let's look again back to the structure of the UGG of our Uniform Grant Guidance. So if you look down at Subpart E, cost principles, that's going to be in the 200 dot 400 through 476. So this is where it starts breaking down different components of allowability, cost allowability. And we're going to show you just a segment of that. But what we're trying to do is pique your interest to where if you really want to go dive in and find what the federal regulations say about food or about something specific, you'll be able to find it. So we're talking today about allowable costs, okay? So this is dot 403. There's a couple other pieces before that, but we're going straight into allowable costs because this is what we describe as what's reasonable, necessary, and allocable. So what's important is that we stop and we pause and we take a look and say, okay, what are the factors that affect the allowability of a cost? Okay, so how do I know? Well, here it is. It's laid out. They say it has to comply with the principles, those cost principles. So what is the grant award about? It has to be consistent with your other policies and procedures, which is, again, why you need to know what your own district level policies and procedures are, both federal and non-federal. And then you have to have it treated consistently. So you can't just treat special ed one way and title another way and gen ed or general funding some other way. It all has to be consistent, and it has to be in accordance with GAAP. Okay, so that's those accounting standards. And it's not to be included as part of cost sharing. So again, this is allowable costs federal funding that we're talking about here. So the best example I can give you for that is that you can't use federal funds. I always give this example of Medicaid. You can't use IDEA funds for your match component of Medicaid because it's another federal program. So you have to use non-federal funding for that. So that's a good example there. And again, you have to have everything adequately documented to check for cost allowability. And that's what those auditors do, right? They have that compliance supplement. It says, go check for this, 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 and this. And it tells them what to check for, and they use that documentation to check and vet that. And then it has to be incurred during the right approved budget performance period. So that's another thing that's always checked. Now back into reasonable and necessary. Take a step back. This is dot 404. We've bumped it up one. This defines what is reasonable. So you would think you already know this, but okay, let's just say it's something that a prudent person under the similar circumstances would make a similar decision for a purchase. So it has to be reasonable. It has to be something that is not a one-off, that it's just that you can say that's how you interpret it. It should be something that most people would interpret. And then section A here talks about whether the type of cost is generally recognized as ordinary and necessary for the operation. So the operation is the key part here. Is it reasonable that we need to do this for the performance of this federal award? What's the intention behind this? Can I run my migrant ed program without buying a tractor? Yes, because that doesn't have anything to do with it, right? But can we also, do we need to buy that food? Do we need to buy these other things? Is that going to help us with the performance and the intention of the award? And then again, back to sound best practices, that there's, again, arm's length bargaining. So think about that. What are best business practices? We don't want to negate those. We want to follow those. And then continuing on with section 404 here about market prices. So are there comparable goods? We want to make sure that, again, you acted with prudence, that it was a reasonable cost. It's in that ballpark figure of five different vendors or 3 different vendors you could choose that all, yeah, if I look this up, this is an average price. So yeah, I'm good to go here. So think about that when we're buying anything. But again, that it's an established practice policy too. So if you're not allowed to buy this in general under any circumstance, don't think that just because this grant award might allow for it, that it's still a good idea. So really, you have to use prudent judgment all over the place. And you have to weigh federal, state, and your local district on everything. Now let's bump to the allocable cost. So this is section 405, and they define this too, that it's allocable if the goods and services involved are chargeable and they're assignable. So they're within that structure that we'll get into the weeds with Sarah a little bit on, specifically to a cost objective. The cost objective is, again, what's the whole program about? Is it going to meet that objective to be able to see that this is the intention behind this grant or this award? And is it going to impact the student outcomes appropriately? And then we have other standards here to say that that it's met if it's incurred specifically for that federal award, and it's benefiting both the federal award and the other work that might be coming in to help support that program. And that, again, it's necessary to the whole operation. Like, think about staffing. You can't run that program without staffing, then the staffing is appropriate. If the staffing is appropriate to what that award is teaching. So, you can't fund some other staff that has nothing to do with that program. So that's what that means. Okay, allocability continued. This is key here, and I highlighted it. All activities have to be in line with this. This is more on the indirect side. So this is targeting saying, hey, you can't just charge indirect to one or the other. Or if you do charge it to the others, you can't exclude it from this one. So think about how that may come into play. And I have that kind of in italics here, that you can't just charge to one and not the other, especially to overcome any fund deficiencies. So don't think that, I have money left over in migrant ed, so I'm going to use that money to plug the hole in the budget over here in special ed. So make sure that you're thinking through how you're utilizing those funds, and if it's going to be allocable and considered reasonable and necessary and appropriate within that award or that program. Okay, and then something else real quick, high level here on the allocability with equipment, and according to CAS, which you've never heard what that is, we'll talk about that here in just a minute, the cost accounting standards. We're not going to go in the weeds on it. But if you have a purchase about equipment or a capital asset, those costs are tied to that program. So that content, whatever that piece of equipment that you bought, that is owned by that program, right? So that's what we're talking about here. So make sure that wherever you're buying it, you're depreciating it accordingly and whatnot. And two, if a contract is subject to that, make sure that the allocation of costs fit in with that cost allocation. And let's talk about what that means here on our next slide. So the cost accounting standards is the set of standards that's designed to achieve, and this is again in quotes, achieve uniformity and consistency in our cost accounting practices. So cost accounting is kind of like, think about it, is that the costs that were incurred in the same purpose, like a direct cost or an indirect cost. But again, with respect to the actual cost objectives of each award. Okay, don't want to go in the weeds. That's really accounting specific there. But what I do want to talk about is if you have something that's going to benefit more than one program and you're kind of trying to split fund things, you have to think about the interrelationship and how blending and braiding may prohibit or may be the right purpose between that blending and braiding, such as if title funding could also be used to support special education. But most likely special education can't also fund something else. So think about the ways those come together. And again, not to confuse my last bullet here, don't confuse an unallowable proportional share cost with a true direct cost. So I get this question a lot with special education, and people will say, well, there's 10 special education students here, so I'm going to just charge a proportional cost. But special education students are gen ed students too. So we can't just say, oh, I'm going to just charge this extra chunk over here, because really they're part of the full population. So that's what I'm thinking about when I'm talking about don't confuse trying to charge a proportional share to one program. Okay, now let's do a little quiz time. Is it necessary? So I have our little reminder here. Is it necessary? That means, does it meet an important program objective? So true or false? And you guys can chime in the chat. Let's see what you guys think. You can purchase 20 lunches for special education staff at the end of the year party with unspent federal special education grant funds. Well, it's special education to special education people. Is this allowable? Is it necessary? I'd love to see what you guys think. Let's get some answers in the chat, because we want you guys to be involved. What does everybody think? Okay, you guys are doing a good job here. That's right. It's not allowable. It's crossed out. It's not okay, because you don't have to purchase lunch to run a special education program, okay? It might feel like a nice thing to do, not the best use of those funds that are federal funds for lots of reasons, for food, and for second, just it's not necessary to run your program. You can get by with running your program without having a year-end party and providing lunch. Okay, more quiz time. Is it reasonable? Remember, it's reasonable if in its nature and the amount, it doesn't exceed something that would be incurred by a prudent person, right? So true or false? You guys can pick out the most expensive version of a product using your grant federal funds, any grant federal funds, even if you can find a whole bunch of other similar products at a much lower price. What do you guys think? I may have made these too easy for you guys. Let's see, what does everybody think? All right, don't be shy. The most expensive, is that prudent? Is that reasonable? The most blingy. So you guys are right. You guys are answering great. So you guys think, what does a prudent person look at? They say, what's the most average cost here? We're not going to go with the highest cost. Now, the only exception I will say, because there's always an exception, what if there's only one that does everything you need it to, but it is more expensive? Then that would be the maybe version of this question. But for the most part, you guys got this right. Great job. Now, how about allocability? Here's a reminder. To what extent are the expenditures charged to a particular grant program benefiting the actual program? So true or false, an instructional media item purchased with title money could be paid with IDEA funds just because we ran out of title funds, but we still have some in the IDEA account. So let's just go use that. Is that allowable? True or false? Can I do it? Can I do it? You might want to do it, but this is why we train in our communities of practice, because we don't want someone to say, well, this one's out of money. Oh, there's money over here. Not allowable. So great job, you guys. Not allowable. Don't just think that because you ran out over here, you can take from over there. Okay, program specific. Okay, right now we're going to dive into selected items of cost. So we're back in 2 CFR 200, and this is the dot 420 through 476. This section is going in the weeds to very programmatic specific types of items. So these are going to talk about, very particular direct costs, indirect costs, food, meetings, supplies, all these different pieces are all in here. And it talks about just more in the weeds. So I want to give you an example. When we go into, this is just a snapshot of 445, for instance, it's going to go in the weeds on goods or services for personal use. Then it has, here's another one, 454, memberships and subscriptions. There's one on food. There's one on gift cards, so there's all these different components in here. So just to give you an idea, if you want to go look up these specific examples and the details on what does the full code say, that's where you're going to go look. Okay. But again, reminders, we want you to check your own LEA policy, because these are high level uniform grant overall kind of guidance, but some programmatics may have those different allowability, and then your own charter may have a different set of principles and policies. So make sure that you're doing that. Check your own board policies. And just remember, there's 2 levels of federal. We talked about uniform grant guidance, but then we talked about program specific. And this is where I'm super excited to introduce Sarah Simont. She is going to go program specific for you with Migrant Ed and give you kind of another view of what that means and how you have to kind of know what to ask, who to ask, and where to look so you can understand some of those programmatic specific pieces. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Sarah Simont. Welcome, Sarah.
Hello, and thank you for having me. So, in preparing for this, one of the things that I wanted to do was really kind of dive into what does the Office of Migrant Ed say when it relates to the use of funds. So, I went and looked at a whole bunch of questions, and in a later slide, I'll have the link where you can look at those question and answers for yourself. But one of the things that I noticed is that they always will ask the same series of questions. They'll say, this may be allowable. So in this example, if there are no other resources available, MEP funds may be used to pay for the cost of food while the migratory children are participating in a field trip. So these kinds of questions, they'll always say, first off, are there any other funds that can be used? And that's important because migrant funds are always the funds of last resort. So the first question is, do you have any other funds available? Next slide. Now we're going to look at the questions. There are 5 of them. Does this activity or service comport with the results of our CNA and SDP? What this means for those of us who use migrant lingo all day long, is this helping us to meet one of our MPOs? And if the answer to that is no, then we have to continue looking at the remainder of the questions. So migrant funds must first be used to meet the identified needs of migratory children. So, and that's based on their migratory lifestyle. For example, if what you're trying to do is help students with credit accrual, we know that the migratory lifestyle makes it very difficult for students to earn credits because they miss school. And so one of the things that we might look at is an identified need is credit accrual. So that would make it an allowable use of funds to help those students. And the next question has to do with, go back one, the activity or service meets the needs of children that are not addressed by other programs. So if that child's needs are being met through Title I, through IDEA, through McKinney-Vento, we can't double dip. We would go with those other funds first, and then if there are unmet needs, then migrant education can help. Okay, next slide. The next one is, are we supplementing rather than supplanting? Which in a lot of ways really is the same as question 3. And the actual documentation, it does say it can be helpful to keep some documentation to show that you have determined that no other funds are available from any other programs. That was in the answer to the question. And then the last one is, do the costs of the service or activity comport with the cost principles that you've just heard about? So are they reasonable and necessary and allocable? So with that in mind, these being the 5 things that they always ask us to look for, now we can go on and look at some of these exceptions, because the exceptions are not just a blanket exception. They always have to be taken into account with these 5 questions. All right, next slide. So all of this information that I just gave you, I got from the Migrant Policy Q&A. This is a searchable database of questions and answers that the Office of Migrant Ed has made available. It is public. You can go to it by using that link. You can also choose topic. So I chose fiscal requirements, subtopic use of funds. So it's a very useful thing, and this will be available in the slides so that you can use it for yourself. Next slide. And then there's a second really useful document called the migrant, or it's called the use of funds. It's on the federal program's website. And so if you follow the breadcrumbs, it's under federal programs funding, and I think it's under fiscal, I think it's federal funds, federal programs, fiscal, and then it's in one of the files, but this link will take you straight to it. And this document is really helpful because it will show you what things you can and cannot do. And I actually, when I went back through it for migrant, I thought, wow, I really wanted to highlight, there's an allowable portion that tells you, here are things you should use migrant funds for. There's an unallowable portion. Here are things you shouldn't use it for. And then we'll get now to the exceptions to the generally unallowable list. So next slide. So here are some exceptions. Do remember that even though they are exceptions, we need to keep in mind those 5 questions before we get any of these items. So some of these souvenirs, memorabilia, or promotional items, such as t-shirts, which I know is a big no-no in Title I, caps or tote bags, imprinted pens, and keychains, may be purchased if reasonable and necessary in order to communicate with families about the program. So this is really for IDNR purposes. So if your liaison is going to be out going into the fields looking for farm workers, sometimes they'll have ball caps with the migrant program logo on it that they're giving to the families that they're meeting in the fields as part of that IDNR process. So this isn't to say that we can just have lots of goodies that we give out to anyone. They really are specifically for the initial purpose of identification and recruitment. Door prizes, movie tickets, gift certificates, and prizes that are reasonable and of nominal cost, and that would include gift cards, may be used especially to promote participation in the local parent advisory council, that local PAC meetings. And one of the things that the Office of Migrant Ed suggested is that it's also a really good idea to focus these kinds of prizes on things that have an educational merit. So if you're going to be doing a math night, purchase some math games, even things that are fairly simple, maybe dice that you can give to families that they can take home with them, or erasable whiteboards for doing math practice at home. So even though we are allowed to do some things that are not allowed in other programs, keep in mind that what we're really trying to do is benefit our students and give them tools that they can use to better access education. So really focus those prizes on things that have educational merit. Books and bilingual books are always a good choice. All right, next slide. This is one that I didn't know. Back in the day, I think I looked and it said no first aid supplies. These can be purchased to use with migrant students during migrant summer school, or is provided as part of a support service to a migrant child. So these may not be allowed in other programs. They are allowed for in the migrant program. One of the 7 areas of concern is a lack of access to healthcare, so that we know that our migratory students, that's one of the areas that may provide a barrier towards their participation in school. So it is an allowable activity. And then this one, you can actually purchase a vehicle, and that is because one of the support services that the migrant program offers is the ability to transport parents and or students in order to access educational, health, or social services or parent involvement. So when you look at the 7 areas of concern, access to social services, access to health services, those are areas that really may create a barrier for our students to participate in school. So one of the things that they recommend is that we find a way to help transport students and parents to, say, dental appointments or food pantries. The problem with having your family liaison provide that transportation is that it really does require special insurance if they're using their car for essentially commercial purposes for work. And so it may be a far better choice to have a district vehicle that is purchased with migrant funds, that is used to transport migratory students and covered by the district's insurance. So that is something you can do. For many of our migrant programs, you wouldn't have enough funds or enough students to make that practical. So you do still need to think about those 5 questions and think about, is this a reasonable use of limited funds? But it is an allowable activity. And I think that is the last slide for me.
That is. And so I want to thank Sarah for presenting, and really she gave a great example of so many of the other types of exceptions, but that they're not broadly exceptions. So when we talk about these different components, the reason these communities of practice are so perfect is because we have program folks that can attend, we have fiscal folks that can attend, and we learn each other's lingo, we learn each other's exceptions, and some of the reasons that might be allowable, like the bus. If you're the business manager and you didn't know anything about that, you might be like, you can't buy a bus with that money, it's for staffing. Well, maybe you can. So now, is that the decision you'll both come to? Maybe not. But we want to help you guys learn to have those conversations. That, hey, I learned about this, that this might, or oh yeah, I heard about that before. We want to start sparking those conversations, and then also just to build that foundational component of, what is the premise of the award? What is the goal? Migrant education, like Sarah was just talking about, the whole premise behind it is to help provide more resources to help students stay and attain their educational goals. It's for the student purpose, right? So that includes in that program that parent engagement and involvement component. So those are things that might be just specific to that, but it's to help those students overall. Just like McKinney-Vento, they have different resources and goals and things that they do to be able to, again, try and keep those kids in school and have better outcomes and participation and graduation. Think about special education, all that funding that helps support those students to have that free and appropriate education and those components they might need to be able to get what's appropriate for them. So all of these different programs have cost allowability features that may be unique to their program, but stop and just pause and think, what is the whole premise of that program? And it's hard when you're in the business office. I can attain to that. You attest to that. You guys think about how many programs there are. You're never going to know all the insides and outs, but you can start to think about the lingo. And then if you see something being proposed by a program director and you think in general, I don't think that's in the uniform grant guidance. But then you can stop and say, but maybe it's within the programmatic allowability and the goal of the award. So let's take a deeper dive and tell me about this. Tell me more. So how can we spark these conversations to tell me more so we understand more? Another thing I wanted to show you, we do have an allowable cost list, and we're revising the link and we'll have it ready when we send these out. But there's a whole list that has allowable for special education. It's not a beautiful book like what Sarah showed you for all federal programs. That makes me think I need to do better for you guys. But same premise, it's going to have allowable, not allowable, budget items. Is there a special requirement that goes with it? Special education can be a little confusing at times because sometimes you can do something, but again, it's not possibly a broadly speaking, it might be a one type of example, because here's one: you could purchase a bus with special education funds. So there's lots of different pieces in there, but that'll be another good list for you guys to help, especially if you're a new manager or if you're in the business office and you just want to have that thing to look at and glance over and make sure when you check in what they've been purchasing that, yep, all that looks like it's allowable. I don't have to worry about taking anything out of that fund. Now, big thing I'm super excited to present to you guys, we are introducing grant management quick guides, and this will be a blended effort between federal programs team and special education team, that we are going to have something that we're still revising some of the final formatting, but and where to store them on the website, but it's going to be a quick reference guide, reference to the code, the overview of the process, hits on the important facts, the guts of it. What is this thing telling me again? Highlights some exceptions, right? So like the food one, that's the first one that we have that's in development, but we want to make sure we had enough types of examples of exceptions so that if you think it might be under one of the exceptions, you'll then say, oh yeah, that was the migrant ed program. It's on this list. Yep, that might be one of them. So now I'm going to just double check to the next level with the program director or so on and so forth. So look for that first quick guide coming out with the recap from today's meeting. I have my little boom because this is my super excitement for you guys. I think quick guides are great because you don't have to go back and say, oh, what month did they talk about that? And what PowerPoint was this on? Just go straight to the quick guide. It'll be a good resource for you. If you have a new person coming in, you can reference the quick guides for them as they start digesting all the components of federal fiscal grant management, which, as you guys know, is somewhat difficult. So now let's talk about upcoming training opportunities. If you guys haven't already registered, there's going to be 2 of these ESEA IDEA workshops. So this is federal program teams and IDEA. We've got these fall conferences. We usually do one in the fall every year at the Nampa Civic Center, but that's kind of hard for everybody to get to. So this year there's one in Coeur d'Alene. Wow. So if that one's closer, we hope you can make it to that one. But if you've ever been to one of these workshops, they're great because you've got almost every staff here presenting on something, right? So we all come together and we say, what are the big ticket items that we know how to make sure that everybody's ready for this new year, ready to attack with confidence. Full trainings, we kind of do skimming on some of the trainings here just to peak those conversations, but this is where you get into the weeds. You get the full component of just maintenance of effort for special ed, for instance, is what I'm doing, or how to do my application. There's going to be some specific to ESSER. And so I want to just take a minute to let any of the other federal programs team, if they wanted to unmute and say, don't forget my session, or just pause to let any of those folks say if they have something to think about coming up at that session. Kathy Gabi, are you on? Does anybody else want to say anything about your sessions?
Yeah, I am here. And just to backtrack a little bit, it was mentioned earlier about the ESSER. And so one of the sessions is an opportunity to do some roundtable discussion about the ESSER cliff and what are we going to do when that is coming up. And then, just all of the different ESEA and IDEA and also assessment is involved in this. So we're trying to involve a lot of time for collaboration and networking. And we certainly want not only federal program directors, but for business managers and others to feel welcome and to have that opportunity as well, if you're able.
Yeah, exactly. This is, if you can get there, if you're able, this is the time to get there. There's going to be a lot of discussion on those topics throughout the year, but this is a good in-person one where you can ask those questions and get deeper possibly into conversations. And I forgot to say this earlier, but we want to say a big thank you to Kathy Gabi, who was the interim director of federal programs for quite many months before Josh has taken the reins. So she is very well knowledgeable about many topics, but make sure that you take the time to reach out to her when you can for questions, but that you also acknowledge all the work she's been putting into this. And we're so excited for these conference or this this workshop to come up, because again, it gives us that in-person way to interact with you all. So hopefully you guys can make it to that. And I always like to close and repurpose and recenter ourselves. But remember your why, and remember the why behind our communities of practice. And that we want to make sure that by utilizing our best practices and confidence in how to effectively run our programs will lead to enhanced student outcomes. That's the whole purpose of why we do what we do. And it's the premise behind all these programs, is that we love our students and we care about them. And we want to make sure that we do what we can on our end to make sure that we enhance those student outcomes. So thank you for being super for our kids. Thank you for closing out your years. And I know you guys are in the muck right now trying to finalize new payroll and last minute onboarding of staff and opening school and all those crazy things. But thank you. You're being super for our kids. So thank you. Thank you. And we're just excited to launch this new year of communities of practice for you. Don't forget to reach out to us. This is the updated listing for federal program staff. Then we have special education staff that'll also be in here for you. And if anytime you have questions or suggestions that you want to pop in, send those to myself and Israel so we can make sure to facilitate that. And with that, we're going to wrap up a couple minutes early. I'm going to stay on if anybody has any questions or concerns or things they want to bring up for next time. And I'm just going to check the chat to make sure there was nothing else on there really quick. Everyone's saying thanks for your help, and I'll make sure to send out my email. And again, I think we've got the link. Somebody put the link into that resource that Sarah shared. So again, thank you so much, everybody. And we're going to wrap it up for this round of communities of practice. And you guys have a great school year, and we'll see you next month. Bye-bye.